Okay, it's gone 4:30. Welcome everyone. It's great to see such a high quality audience here on a Friday. And it's my particular pleasure to introduce Johan Vulhaus. Johan is a full professor at Utrecht University. Field is cognitive neurobiology. Also holds an honorary fellowship at St Catherine's College and is a life member of Clare Hall. That's correct. It is quite interesting of Johan. His connection with Cambridge is very strong, perhaps as strong as Utrecht, which is great. And I guess part of that came from the early days when you worked with people like Gabriel Horn. Brian McCabe is in the audience. I guess too there's some connection there. Working in social preference in chicks, in printing. Also had a stint, I think, with Richard Morris in Edinburgh. And your PhD was in Groningen. Now, Groningen, this is a New Zealander trying to say Groningen. I know that's not right.
It's not bad, not bad. Groningen.
I'm not sure I can do that. But anyway, that was 1989. I think it was thereabouts. It's a year actually when I started my PhD, so we're not too dissimilar in age. Johan's interests extend to the behavioural, neural and cognitive mechanisms of learning, memory and development. Current research is concerned with neural mechanisms of birdsong, memory and neurocognitive parallels between birdsong, speech and language. You also have a theoretical interest in a relationship with evolution, cognition and the brain. And some notable collaborations include Noam Chomsky, which is really interesting. So without further ado, let me hand you over to Johan and title your talk, Language, Mind and the Brain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those very kind words, and thank you also, and particularly John Mullen, for inviting me to give this lecture here. I've been coming to these sessions ever since I arrived in the early 1980s, so now I'm giving one myself, which is a particular honor for me. I'm going to talk about the cognitive biology of language. I changed my title. And so what I'm trying to tell you is that we, my colleagues and I, we see language as a biological system. It's part of human biology. So that means you can also study biological aspects of it, like you can study any other biological phenomenon. So for instance, you can ask questions about the evolution of language, about the development of language in the individual, about the mechanisms of language, neural and otherwise. And if you look closely at this very nice drawing, then you see a little cloud in the top right in the shape of a human brain. So I'm going to talk about possible similarities between human language and birdsong, strange as it may seem. And also, I use the word cognitive. So also, of course, we see a language as a cognitive system. And that leads me to a paper that my colleagues and I published slightly more than a year ago in Biological Reviews, a very good journal. My colleagues being Stephen Crane and Ian Roberts. Ian Roberts, of course, is Professor of Linguistics here in Cambridge. And we had a paper about reviewing what is the state of play with the cognitive revolution. And of course, with an audience like this, I don't have to tell you what that is, what that was. And we came up with some interesting and slightly disturbing conclusions, I think. And I quote, although contemporary learning theory has almost completely embraced the cognitive approach, I think you can all agree with that, the study of language has witnessed a clear empiricist trend to revert back to a kind of new behaviorism. And I think that's a very bizarre and worrying trend. And just one quote that summarizes the cognitive approach to learning theory by the great Nick McIntosh, former head of the department here, and he used to sit here always. And he wrote a number of classic books, of course, and we cite him in that paper. And this is the sort of summarizing quote, the view of conditioning as the establishment of new reflexes or the strengthening of SR connections, a view which dominated Western learning theory for half a century, which is a very long time, has gradually given way to a view of conditioning as the acquisition of knowledge about the relationship between events in an animal's environment. Knowledge which may not be immediately apparent in any change in behavior at all. So we're not talking about behaviorist approaches, stimuli and responses. We're talking about knowledge which is in the mind of the animal in this case. Okay, so learning theory is fine, but what about language? Well, of course, the cognitive revolution was about learning particularly and about language. And there was the contrast between, on the one hand, Skinner, the arch behaviorist, who published a book in 1957, Verbal Behavior. And basically, I think one could say, he says that language is basically a motor skill acquired through reinforcement learning, and so you acquire the verbal behavior that is language. And as all of you will know, about 2 years later, Chomsky wrote a book review of this book, and which is sort of like a little book in itself. And he said that this is all wrong. It's completely different. Speech is an externalization of language structures that are composed in a mind-internal computational cognitive system. So it's all happening in the mind, and sometimes you can see externalized evidence of what's going on in your mind. So completely opposing views, and for a long time, I think linguists tended to think in the cognitive kind of way about language. But recently, and we note that in the paper, that many contemporary authors contend that language is a means of communication, it's a sort of functional definition, that is learned solely through the observation of external events and culturally transmitted to successive generations. So again, it's purely a learning process. It's almost like what Skinner said. So there's a very clear trend, I think, going back to the 1950s almost. So this is actually a very popular view for some bizarre reason. And so the idea is that language is nothing special, it's an evolved skill. So non-human animals will also have some kind of language, logically speaking. And the acquisition of language by children is usage-based, so it's using a large amount of data, just like large language models, basically. So the idea is basically very bit like that. And more about that later. So two big questions are arising when you talk about the cognitive biology of language. It's not easy to study it because there's no consensus really. What is actually language? So first we have to define our terms. If we don't know what language is, then how can we study it? And also, if you talk about comparative biology, how does evolution proceed? There's also different opinions about that, and that tells you a lot about how language could have evolved. And I will talk about both of these. So first of all, what is language? Well, if you ask a linguist, they can tell you first what language is not. So language is not the same as speech, despite Tom Wolfe's whole book about it, The Kingdom of Speech. I think it was his last book before he died. And a lot of people see language that way. Language is what's coming out of your mouth. And of course, you can externalize language in all kinds of ways. You can also use sign language, for instance, or you can write it down. Or most of the time, you don't externalize it at all. So you and I, we are all using language very much at this very moment in our minds. We're creating structures in our minds, and we're not externalizing them at all. So that would be the wrong avenue to go into. What about the idea that language is the same as communication? So if I ask my students every year, what is language? Can you define language? Well, it's a form of communication. And of course it can be used for communication, but most of the time I think it isn't, as I just indicated. So most of the time we think language is used internally to structure your thoughts, more or less. And you don't need to be involved in communication, and that would be language, but you can use it for other means. And of course you can communicate in all kinds of other means. And other animals also communicate. All animals communicate. And you wouldn't necessarily assume that all animals have language. Also plants communicate. And again, you wouldn't necessarily assume that plants have a sort of a language. So these are sort of odd definitions, I think, and somewhat misleading. So what is a language then? In our view, well, a quote from a paper, human language is grounded on a particular computational mechanism. So it's happening in your mind. It's, of course, realized neurally, so you can study the neural mechanisms that yields an infinite array of structured expressions. So you can use that mechanism in your mind to create an infinite array of expressions. So it's an incredibly creative force in your mind, you might say. Each expression is assigned an interpretation of two interfaces. So there's this sort of abstract, somewhat abstract structure building going on in your mind. And you can do two things with it. On the one hand, so the sort of blue box at the top would be the sort of system for generating these expressions, these hierarchical structures. And on the one hand, these structures can be interpreted by some other system. Linguists would call it the conceptual intentional interface. So basically the system of thought, roughly speaking, that sort of interprets those structures in your mind. So what does it actually mean? And more about that in a moment. On the other hand, you can, if you want to, externalize language. So you can speak, or you can write it down, or you can use sign language. You don't have to, but you can. And also you can receive language. So you can listen to someone else, or you can watch someone else using sign language, or you can read a book. And so you can, this is sort of the connection with the outside world, as it were. So you can, there are special systems for that. And so these are the two interfaces, basically. So this is roughly how linguists, or at least a lot of linguists, think about language. And I talked about structure building. So what kind of structures are being built in your mind at this very moment? Hierarchical structures. So it's in a recent paper we titled it "Structures, Not Strings." So we're talking about structures in your mind, not just strings of words that come out of your mouth. But what's happening in your mind is much more complicated, namely the formation of hierarchical structures. And just for a non-linguist like me, a reminder of how that works. Well, for instance, this is an example from a book that I edited, and I realized I should update it. So I assume that this is a vegetarian butcher. The brother of the butcher looks at himself, and you can, what is himself referred to? Well, of course, logically you would think, well, it refers to the closest noun, so the butcher. But every child knows that himself refers to the brother of the butcher. So it's a bit of an odd thing that it doesn't seem the logical way of saying it, of having the connections. And the clue is that you have to look at the hierarchical structure in the mind. And then it turns out that the noun phrase, the brother of the butcher, is the highest in the hierarchy compared to the noun phrase, the butcher. So apparently himself refers to the highest noun phrase in the hierarchy. That's apparently how it works in our mind. So keep that in mind. So what about the biology then of language? So what can we say about the evolution of language? Well, it's not easy for a number of reasons, but we did have a go in this particular paper. And, well, first of all, let's see what Darwin has to say about it. Darwin had a whole book about the evolution of cognition. He didn't call it that way, the descent of man, and he was quite clear about it. So he said, and I quote, "There's a much wider interval in mental power between one of the lowest fishes," could have said birds, I think, "and one of the higher apes than between an ape and man." So he was quite clear about it, that there's a sort of kind of hierarchy in the evolutionary tree, and higher apes are much closer to us than they are to other lower animals. And so the idea from this it would be that if there's anything in the animal kingdom that has anything to do with language, then that would be our closest relatives. And intuitively that makes a lot of sense. So here's a evolutionary tree, a very simple one, catering for all kinds of beliefs. And so if you just look at it, well, the last common ancestor of modern humans and modern chimps was walking around about 5-6 million years ago, whereas the last common ancestor of modern birds and modern humans was probably crawling around, some kind of lizard, about 300 million years ago. So there's a huge difference between that. So intuitively you would think, well, if there's anything language-like, we must be looking at these guys here. However, if you actually do that, then there's some curious phenomenon, which was Hauser and co. First noted, that if you look at our closest relatives and compare them to humans, so human infants, they acquire the speech sounds by imitation learning. So they imitate the sounds that they hear from their parents or from their peers, and slowly but surely, words emerge, etc. So we humans are very good at vocal imitation learning. But curiously, our closest relatives, the great apes, they don't do that kind of thing. So they make sounds, as we all know, but they don't copy those sounds from other individuals, and neither do monkeys. But very remotely related taxa, like songbirds, they do copy the beautiful songs that they sing from other individuals. So they're not born with the song, but they have to learn the song by imitation learning, which takes quite a long time sometimes. And likewise, certain marine mammals like dolphins and whales also have this ability for vocal imitation learning. So there's a very curious discrepancy in the sort of scala naturae that our closest relatives, in this case, don't behave like us at all, whereas these very remote relatives, they do behave like us. So, and this is illustrated in this cartoon that someone made for an essay we published in Nature, where the ape or monkey doesn't have a clue what to do, but the parrot, which is also a very good vocal imitator, not only could say apple, but he even knows what kind of apple it is. Although someone pointed out to me that he actually got it wrong because it's not Golden Delicious at all, but it's a Granny Smith. But they're very good at imitation learning. So the question arises then that given this state of affairs, that are we dealing for a particular trait, speech for instance, are we dealing with common descent? So is the fact that we have a most recent common ancestor with great apes, is that important? Are we dealing with what biologists call evolutionary convergence, that not closely related taxa in the branches of the evolutionary tree have come up with similar solutions to similar problems? So the problem in this case would be vocal imitation learning. And apparently songbirds have done that. So they seem to have evolved this independently. So, and there's no way of telling that beforehand, so you have to investigate that. So that tells you something about how things could have evolved. So this is the song of a chaffinch, well known of course, and on the right are sonograms, so frequency on the y-axis over time, of two adult males. It's usually the males that sing in most of these songbird species, not females, and two adult males and their respective sons. And as you can already see from the sonograms, the songs of the sons remember the songs of the fathers. And it turns out that it's not inherited genetically, but they have to be exposed to the song of their father for quite a few weeks, and then they more or less learn the song of the father. So they sometimes have a perfect imitation of the song of their father. So they're very good vocal learners. And now you hear the first beginnings of a zebrafinch male after a relatively brief exposure to a tutor song from an adult male, probably his father. And so this just doesn't really sound like a song. It's sort of squeaky noises that it makes. And then when it's a few weeks older, you'll hear something that's already resembling the adult song. So it's so-called plastic song. It's almost adult, but it can still change. And then finally, they end up with the so-called crystallized song. So this is, in the zebrafinches, they only have one song, and this is what they have to deal with for the rest of their life. And so they're all different between individuals. And so there are different phases in the development of song. And so they're not born with the complete song, but they have to develop it very slowly, which reminded a lot of people of what's happening in human infants. As I already indicated, human infants start with sort of, cooing and then babbling, and then very slowly some words emerge. And so there's an interesting parallel here. So this transitional phase, which we call babbling in human infants and subsong in songbirds. And there's another parallel, apart from the fact that they're both learning, there's another parallel, a sensitive period. So in both cases, early in life, it's much easier to learn to make these sounds than later in life. So in songbirds, that's been well known for all the species studied so far. And of course in humans as well. So this girl here, which happens to be my daughter, when she was this age, she could learn 2 languages at the same time very easily. And now she's 22 years old, studying PPE, and she's trying to learn Chinese now. And she's having a really hard time and she will never be fluent in Chinese. So apparently the sensitive period has passed and it becomes more and more difficult. So there are very interesting behavioral parallels between the 2 very different phenomena. And in fact, there are other parallels as well. So we listed those in the review paper and also in the book with various chapters by various people talk about these parallels. And so we talked briefly about the behavioral parallels. There are also neural parallels that I will briefly discuss, genetic parallels, and of course then the key question is, are there also linguistic parallels? Do they have some kind of grammar in their songs, some kind of syntactic structure? Okay, so this is the human brain, well known of course, and not for nothing on the left-hand side. And of course, as you all know, there are 2 regions that have traditionally been found to be important for speech and language. On the one hand, the frontal lobe, we have Broca's area, and on the other hand, in the temporal lobe, superior temporal lobe, we have Wernicke's area. And as you all know, so Broca's area has, among other things, something to do with the production of speech and language, and Wernicke's area has something to do with the processing of speech and language, roughly speaking. There are lots of other, of course in reality it's much more complicated, so there are different structures involved around Broca's and Wernicke's, like networks you might say, and they are interconnected in complex ways with dorsal and ventral connections, and they all have a role to play in syntax and semantics. But we won't go into that now. Suffice to say that, the distinction that I just made. So this is a male zebrafinch and with a tiny brain. But when you look into the brain, it turns out to be actually quite complicated, and it's getting more complex the more we know about it. And this is the summary of several decades of work by us and other labs. And basically what the findings were that, so this is a side view of the brain of a songbird, that there are certain regions in the brain that are activated, which you can measure in all kinds of ways, when the animal is singing, so sometimes called the song system. On the right, so these orange blobs here, they are always activated when the animal is singing. And on the left-hand side, you see some yellowish blobs that are activated when the animal is listening to a song or when the animal hears a song. And there's a particular subset of those yellow regions called the NCM that is particularly active when the animal is exposed to familiar song, so to the tutor song. And more about that in a moment. So this is the sonogram of a zebrafinch song, so frequency over time, and there are different elements in it. And if you plot it like this, so on the top is a tutor song sonogram, and so for instance the father of these 2 youngsters below it, and there's a poor learner and a good learner, and the poor learner managed to copy 2 elements of the tutor song, whereas the good learner managed to copy almost all of the elements of the tutor song. So there's variation, so some are better learners than others, and if you plot that variation on the x-axis here, so the similarity from 0 to 100%, then in that particular sub-region, the yellow blob, then either when you use immediate early gene expression as a measure for neuronal activation, as we often do, or other labs have used traditional electrophysiology, basically gives you the same result, that there is activation of neurons in that particular part of the brain related to the strength of learning. So the more the animals have learned about the tutor song, the more there is activation in that particular part of the brain. And the relationships are quite strong, in fact. So if that is the case, and this is just another figure from the other side of the brain, if that is the case, then so that you have a kind of Broca-like, so it's all Broca-like and in inverted commas, or Wernicke-like regions in the brain of the bird, then you can make some predictions. So if it's the case that the yellow ones are, in this case, the beige ones are involved in production, and the greenish blobs are involved in the processing of song, then you can make predictions. For instance, if you make a hole in that particular greenish blob there, then you would predict some kind of, almost like a Wernicke aphasia kind of syndrome, that the production wouldn't be affected by it, but the processing of song would be affected by it. And so that's a clear prediction, and this is what we tried to test. Sharon Gobes, who was a PhD student of mine, and myself. And so Sharon made very tiny lesions with botanic acid in the NCM, in that particular region there, and looked at the results behaviorally. So you couldn't really, clinically, you couldn't see anything about the animals. So she had, of course, a control group, sham group, and what happened was like this. So this diagram shows you on the y-axis, the preference score for the tutor song. So for whatever reason, that we won't go into now, once they learn the song, they have a preference to hear the tutor song over an unfamiliar song. So they seem to recognize the tutor song as such. And so, as you can see, it's almost like 90%. So they have a very strong preference. This is before surgery on the left-hand side, way above 50%. So they strongly prefer to hear the tutor song. And then on the right-hand side, the two bars, so the orange bar, I think it's orange, is the control group that had a sham surgery, and the lesion group is on the right. And as you can see, they are significantly impaired. So it's not completely wiped out. So some people said that we should make bigger lesions, but it's significantly impaired. So they seem to be impaired in the recognition of the tutor song, which is interesting because those same animals, if you look at their own output, so they produce their own song, which they've copied to some extent from the tutor song. And this is just one example. Before and after surgery, they're exactly the same. So their own output is exactly the same as before surgery, but at the same time, they seem to have trouble recognizing the example, the tutor song. So it's almost like a sort of miniature Wernicke aphasiacs, that they have no problem producing the sounds, but they have problems processing the sounds in this case. Okay, so this just summarizes what I just said. That's what it sounds like.
Nous parlons avec l'hémisphère gauche.
So this is Paul Broca saying, actually it's me, but he once said apparently that we speak with the left hemisphere. And Wernicke could have said something similar in German, that we also process speech with the left hemisphere. And as we all know, it's very much lateralized language. What about animals? Turns out that, so this is the zebrafinch, actually my daughter is speaking, that there's something similar going on in our zebrafinches. It's a very complicated figure, but just concentrate on that bit there. If you expose them to a novel song, there's no difference in activity, measured as gene expression in this case, between the left and the right hemisphere. But if you expose them to the tutor song, there is a huge difference between activity in the left and in the right hemisphere. So they're also left lateralized in this particular case. And this is has a very interesting parallel in human infants. So this is a study by De Haan and Lamberts et al. With French babies, 2 months old. Somehow they did fMRI on these babies. I don't know how they managed that, but they found a very interesting result here, that the babies could listen to a story being told by a woman. And of course, they didn't have a clue what the story was all about. But the story was either told by their own mother or by an unknown woman. And it turns out that particularly in the left Wernicke's area, there is a significant difference in activity when the story is told by the mother and by an unfamiliar woman. I can still say mother, I suppose, at least. Interestingly, so that looks a bit like what happened in the zebrafinches, that when they are exposed to the tutor song, there is lateralization, and when they're exposed to a novel song, there's no such lateralization. And if you spell it out for the zebra finches, so this is research done by Sanne Moorman, who was also a PhD student with me, now working in Groningen. And she plotted here, so if you look at the solid line, those are the ones that were re-exposed to the tutor song for briefly. And then you can see activity in the NCM, and on the y-axis is a lateralization ratio. So everything above 0 is left lateralized, and everything below 0 is right lateralized. And as you can see that the more they've learned about the tutor song, which is on the x-axis, the more the information, the responsiveness is lateralized to the left hemisphere. This is also what people have found in human research, where either first or second language acquisition, that there's also a trend for activity to move from either bilaterally or from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. So a very interesting parallel. And this is another example of the same study with the 2-month-old French babies, that if they had a story, bits of the story that were repeated, they already heard it before, then there was less activity to the repeated bits of the story in the left hemisphere, but not in the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere, again, has activity related to the strength of memory. So very interesting parallels, I think. And there are more, but I won't have time for them. What about genetic parallels? Well, most of you will know the story of the KE family. I think they live in Slough, and they have, half the family has severe speech problems, which officially is known as developmental verbal dyspraxia. So they sometimes you can't quite hear what they're saying. And I have an example, I think, at the moment. And it turns out that the affected members of the family, so those are the dark blue symbols here, they all have a mutation to a particular gene, as you probably all know, the FOXP2 gene. And it turns out that this FOXP2 gene is highly conserved in evolution. So if you look at the amino acids in the protein of this gene, then there are very tiny differences between the species. So there are only 2 differences in amino acids between humans and chimpanzees, only 3 between humans and mice, and only 5 between humans and zebra finches. So it's more or less the same gene. And so one question you could ask is, what happens if you knock down that gene in a songbird? What happens to the song? Well, something does happen. So this is Constance Scharf and her team in Berlin. They did exactly that. So they knocked down the FOXP2 gene in a particular area X, is a motor area in the brain. And they found that, and they let the animals grow up, and they were tutored and everything, and they found that the animals had incomplete songs, so there were bits missing, and also the songs were not stable. So every rendition of the song, which usually is quite stable, but in this case it was very unstable, so they seemed to have problems producing proper songs. So an interesting parallel here that in both cases FOXP2 seems to have something to do with vocal production, you might say. And of course, in the newspapers there was, so this was discovered by, the FOXP2 gene was discovered by Simon Fisher and colleagues, then in Oxford, now at Max Planck in Nijmegen. And he always takes great effort to, with every talk he gives, that, we can't say that this is a language gene. Of course, the newspapers were immediately full, scientists found a language gene, and he would say, well, it's not a language gene. After all, genes make proteins, not behavior. And also, FOXP2 is a transcription factor, so it's like an immediate early gene. It affects the expression of other genes. So if there's something wrong with FOXP2, then lots of other things are going wrong. Whatever effect it has, and we don't know all of that, is in combination with numerous other genes, probably. Mutation also has multiple effects, not only in speech. So for one thing, on average, the non-verbal IQ of the affected members is also lower than that of the non-affected members. And if you look at the brain of these people, then this is from a review paper by Varga Kadam and colleagues, and they Those yellow blobs show a loss of grey matter in different parts of the brain of the affected members compared to the non-affected members. So it turns out that there is loss of grey matter in the inferior frontal gyrus, but there's also loss of grey matter in the caudate nucleus and also the cerebellum. So there's quite a lot of things going on, not all of them speech and language related.
I have a rare speech disorder called Fox PH2. If you want to know more information about that, you can. Go to Google on the KE family.
So this boy is a member of the KE family, so he tells us, and he has his own YouTube channel. So that's why I can show it, I think. And he's a very interesting boy. He has all kinds of interests and stories to tell. And the point is, I think, so he clearly has difficulty speaking, getting the words out. But if you listen closely, there's not much wrong with his English grammar, I think. He speaks proper English, he just has difficulty getting the words out. And also, I don't have the movie here, but for copyright reasons, one of his hobbies is to sort of subtitle with sign language certain hits, particularly from the 1960s. Cliff Richard is his favorite. So I thought I'd spare you that. But so he uses sign language, and I can't really find out whether it's proper British Sign Language. No one can tell me that. But if it is, then apparently he's found another way of externalizing the language that is in his mind. And in this case, he has no problem getting it out. In other words, it looks like maybe this FOXP2 gene indeed is not a language gene, but has something to do with something else, with the motor processes that are involved in making the sounds that belong to language, and not with language itself, nothing to do with grammar or syntax. But nevertheless, there's an interesting parallel yet again with the songbirds. Okay, then the big question is, given all these parallels at the behavioral, neural, and genetic level, is there a cognitive parallel? Is there some kind of evidence for some kind of syntactic structure in these songbirds' songs? And so this is the Bengalese finch here, which has quite a complex song with all kinds of probabilities of one element following the other, and feedback loops and things like that. And so some people have argued that, well, maybe they have some kind of syntactic ability, and so let's test it. So, and we reviewed, in 2011, we reviewed all the evidence at the time and concluded there's no such thing. They are complex structures, but nothing like the hierarchical structures that we have in human language. And so basically they're complex strings of sounds. But other people disagreed. So soon after we published this paper, there was a paper in Nature Neuroscience, no less, by two Japanese colleagues who claimed exactly the opposite, that songbirds do possess the spontaneous ability to discriminate syntactic rules. And it's a bit of a complicated experiment, so I have to go. But this is the idea, that basically what they looked at was some kind of avian form of center embedding of phrases. So trivial example, previous study was about starlings, so we used this example. The starling was tired, and in the phrase, and then you put another phrase in the middle of it. The starling, the cat's was tired. And in theory, you can go on ad infinitum with this. This is called center embedding, so it's a particular form of sort of merge, you might say. And so they tried to do something like that in these songbirds. And I think this is the complicated figure from their papers. So this is the kind of stimuli they use. Of course, they use words, but they use different sounds that are Bengalese finch sounds, and they put them together in certain ways. And they expose the animals to particular orders of different elements. And they do that either in a center embedded way or in a non-embedded way. So these two, COR and CES, they have center embedded. So there's a central element here, and there's a symmetrical opposition of these different elements here too. And these are sort of more random. And what they did was they trained them with these embedded ones, and then they exposed them to either the syntactically correct or incorrect strings of sounds, and then they looked at the responsiveness to these sounds. And it turns out that they respond differently to the correct ones, so that you can see that here, for instance, that there's no significant change in behavior when they're exposed to the correct ones, and there is a change in behavior. They stop doing what they're doing when they hear the incorrect ones. So lo and behold, they can actually discriminate between grammatical and non-grammatical phrases. However, if you look at it in more detail, which we did, so after some prompting, the authors kindly gave us their data, their raw data, and my colleague Gabriel Bekkers in Utrecht, he analyzed them in some detail, and he found out that if you look at the training strings here, so this is what they were exposed to, so either single embedded, so that one embedding as it were, or non-embedded. And if you generalize them, then you get these kind of 16 different patterns, possible patterns that they're exposed to. And these are all the different test conditions. So either the correct grammatical testing conditions or the ungrammatical testing conditions. And what Gabriel did was he color-coded the different elements of the strings of sound. And it turns out that the so-called grammatically correct strings are actually very similar to the training strings. So they're not just examples of a particular category, but they're exactly the same sounds. So when they hear the so-called grammatically correct strings, they hear very familiar sounds to what they've heard during the training session. And then when they hear the incorrect strings, they hear something quite completely novel almost, in most cases. So, and of course we know that they're very good vocal learners, and auditory learners. So, of course, you can solve this problem very easily by just recognizing familiar strings and responding differently to unfamiliar strings. So there's no reason to invoke any kind of grammatical knowledge in these birds. And so, and of course, Nature Neuroscience was unwilling to publish our commentary. I don't know why. And so we published in a sort of lowly journal, but nevertheless, and we never heard from these authors again on this topic. So, okay, so actually they don't. There's no evidence for it, at least. Okay, what about another species, Japanese great tits? So there was another paper, another Nature journal, Nature Communications. Nature really likes this kind of stuff, and this is about compositional syntax. So this is actually quite interesting, if it were true. So what is compositionality? So it's a very crucial phenomenon in human language. It relates back to the structure sensitivity that I mentioned earlier, that the meaning of a complex expression is a function of the meaning of its parts, so the meaning of the words, and the mode of composition, so the way that these words are put together in your mind in these hierarchical structures. And so this is what these authors try to demonstrate in the birds. So this is actually the European great tit, but it's almost exactly, it looks like the Japanese one. And this is one of their results. So this is, on the top you see a certain behavior, scanning, so they move their heads from left to right. And at the bottom here you see approaching the speaker in response to sound. So they either have a background noise or they have a particular call. So this is not about songs but about calls. So either a call called ABC or a call called D, or a composite call ABCD. So these are naturally occurring calls, and they were played from a speaker. And what happened was that, with the white noise, nothing happened, but they respond in a particular way to ABC. So they quite a lot of scanning, not so much approaching, all the way around with D, and with ABCD sort of in the middle. And so they also say, well, this is some indication that there is compositionality going on here. So they respond in one way to the elements, and they respond in another way when the elements are composed as a string in this case. But of course, you could also say, well, actually, it looks like ABCD is like sort of intermediate between the response to one or the other, and the same here. So that doesn't tell you all that much. And they sort of agree with that, and they said, well, what happens if we turn it around? So if we have the ABCD call, composite call, or we artificially turn it around with a computer and make it a DABC call. So we compose them differently ourselves. And lo and behold, they respond differently to that. So they say, well, this is clear evidence for compositionality. So if you compose them, if they're composed in this way, they respond like that, and then differently when it's that way. But of course, you could say, well, actually, they hardly respond at all in this case. And here maybe a little bit more, but there's not much of a response to it at all. So maybe they're just confused that they hear something that they never heard before in this particular combination. So I would hardly call that an example of compositionality. Also, this is of course about the order of the elements in the string of sounds. And in human language, the order of elements isn't all that important. It's the hierarchical structures in your mind that are important. So whether we say men and women or women and men, it's basically we're saying the same thing. Also, if you look at the phrase below, old men and women, exactly the same phrase can mean two different things. You can either mean old men and women of any age, or old men and old women. It's exactly the same phrase, but it's composed differently in your mind and meaning different things. So order is not important. And so what we do all the time, I think, when we construct those hierarchical structures in our mind, is something like that. And the technical term is merge. So we merge one element with another element. The product of that merge is merged again with another element in a recursive kind of way. So for instance, the sentence, I saw the man with the telescope, you can merge it in two ways, basically. You start with the man and merge that with the telescope. So you have the man with the telescope. You merge that with I saw, and then you have I saw a man, and the man was looking through a telescope, basically. I saw the man with the telescope. Exactly the same sentence you can construct in another way. You can start with I saw, merge that with the man. So I saw the man. Well, how did you see the man? Well, I actually used the telescope because it was quite far away. So I saw the man with the telescope. Exactly the same sentence again, the order is the same, but quite a different meaning depending on what you constructed in your mind. And there's no equivalent of this in any of the birdsong stuff that we looked at. So if you come back to an earlier question, are we dealing with common descent or convergence? I think we're dealing with both. And let me try and explain that. So on the one hand, there is indeed homology. There are certain factors that we all have in common. So whether it's mice or zebra finches or chimps or humans, we all have certain neural mechanisms involved in vocal production, in auditory learning as well, and memory. We all have FOXP2 genes. So the machinery is there for all of us. And it just depends on which evolutionary route we have taken in terms of convergence, what we do with the machinery. So we have used that machinery apparently in the course of evolution to evolve auditory vocal learning, and so have songbirds. But for some reason, higher apes haven't done that. And finally, I think it's still the case, there's no evidence to contradict it, that there seems to be specialization in our case, that we have a kind of syntactic structure building capacity that no other species seems to have. So finally, there was 2 months ago, we published a brief letter in Nature. So finally, Nature said yes to something, but only a letter though, and with some colleagues about AI. We claim that AI doesn't really model human language, and so they put this is the online version where they changed the title slightly to 3 reasons why AI doesn't model human language. And the reasons are as follows. So first of all, large language models are probabilistic models, so they use a lot of data to predict which word will follow the word that you give it, the system, basically. And so they come up with a lot of cliches, in fact. So the probabilistic models of externalized language data, and they need lots of input. They steal it wherever they can, basically. Whereas human language is truly generative, so we don't need lots of input to come up with phrases. Also, acquisition of language in human infants doesn't need enormous amounts of data. That the large language models, they're large because they need lots of data. We don't need that as infants. It looks like infants are immediately capable of interpreting language in certain ways. And finally, large language models can model impossible languages just as well. So impossible languages, Andrea Moro is a key figure in that. So if you come up with some kind of grammar that no language uses, and we can learn that kind of grammar, and so can LLMs. In fact, there's a recent paper that shows that. They can, if they get lots of information about this bizarre grammar, they can also make predictions about which word is going to be followed by which other word. So, and of course, they're not part of any human language. So an impossible language is by definition not real language, but the LLMs don't make a distinction between that. And interestingly, there was an interview with Sam Altman, the OpenAI CEO. I think he was not a CEO for a short period, but now he's taken back again. An interview in MIT Technology Review, and he said something quite interesting, or bizarre if you like. So it looks very much like, he's thinking in a very sort of behaviorist way, that, the way that these LLMs construct, analyze language is in a very behaviorist way, I think. And he said, and I quote, "I believe, but I'm not certain, that we're going to figure out a way out of this thing of you always just need more and more training data." It sounds a bit like an AI-generated text. He says, "Humans are existence proof that there is some other way to train intelligence, and I hope we find it." So intelligence has to be trained, apparently. It's a very behaviorist overtones. And so basically saying that, humans have a way of dealing with language without all this training. So I hope we can find that too in our models. And so very bizarre in a way, but he seems to almost have seen the light, but it takes a little while to get that, I think.
The human mind is a very marvelous thing.
The human mind is a very marvelous thing, said Chomsky once. So this is my sort of natural language generated text, take-home message. Natural language appears to be unique to the human mind and has no parallels either in animal or artificial intelligence. And on that note, I just want to show you some of the people that I work with, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Johan. That was a really thought-provoking talk. At this point, people want to leave for questions. Please do so as quickly, as quietly as possible, and then we'll take questions. Right, questions from the audience. Who would like to start? Well, I've got one. I'll start.
Okay.
So, you mentioned sensitive periods, and my group's very interested in these so-called sensitive periods in a different context. But what are the determining factors, which is the opening and closure? I mean, what do we know about some of the neural mechanisms?
We know very little of that, I think. But it's, some theories talk about, perineuronal nets or something, that there is a sort of limit to when the neurons can actually handle these things, sort of, roughly speaking. So maybe we have to look in that direction. Of course, in imprinting, it was a bit easier, perhaps, that in imprinting is also a sensitive period, like in most developmental phenomena. And in imprinting, the idea was that once they've imprinted on something, they spend all their time with that particular stimulus and they ignore other stimuli, so they simply are not motivated to learn anything else. So,
I mean, are there parallels in NMDA receptor plasticity and subunit composition?
Yeah,
that type of
I don't think we know that yet. No.
Well, perhaps not. Okay. Other thoughts? Miriam.
Two questions. So the first one is, I was just about the interpretation of the finding you were showing about naturalization in birds, of imitation versus recognition of novel strengths, if I'm
Yes.
not mistaken. So there was naturalization of the first one, but not of the second one. And so what's the intended interpretation of that? So the first one is that they are sort of recognizing the sequences, and then that in the novel case, they there is no processing, that there is no recognition? Or
Yeah, so
wasn't sure what
yeah, so basically it seems to be memory related. So when they are exposed to the tutor song, which they obviously recognize, then there's a strong lateralization. There's also responsiveness when they hear a novel song, but it's not lateralized. So apparently, and a bit like what happened in the infants, that when they heard the story told by the mother, there was clear lateralization to the left Wernicke's area, and no such lateralization when they heard it from another woman.
Sure, but is the interpretation then that birds or kids, that they are not recognizing?
Yes,
They
yes.
do not process.
Yes, and as you could see, the more they learned about it, the more it's lateralized. So apparently, this is how you do vocal imitation learning. That you
Is there a way to measure this in some way to know what the consequences of being exposed but not recognized, and vice versa?
how do you mean?
Well, in other words, how do we know that birds are not processing the novel sequences?
Yeah, well, I suppose, if you would expose them for a longer time, there are some experiments have shown that if you expose them, this is actually quite interesting. There's Sharon Gobes, who used to be my student. She did experiments where she exposed the songbirds first to one song and then to another song. And she has some evidence, I'm not quite sure how clear it is, but that when they are exposed to the second song, there's much more going on in the right hemisphere. So it sounds a bit like, the initial learning involves lateralization to the left, and then when there's a latecomer song arriving, then they suddenly switch to the right hemisphere.
Sorry for the second one. There was, I don't know if you've seen, recently a report in Eli from a group in Warwick about potentially sort of embedded sequences in orangutans.
Yes, I saw that.
Just wondering what you thought of that.
Yeah, well, I didn't have a close look at it yet, but it might be some similar case as we saw before. That it doesn't really cut it, I think. But I have to study it in more detail.
Question, Matt.
Very, very interesting. I want to go kind of the end and the start together. So one of the points of challenge in the original Chomsky response to verbal behaviour views or behaviourism was simply that in principle some of these complex syntactic structures couldn't be learned. But it seems to me that large language models, they may require exceptional quantities of data, but they do succeed in learning the syntactic structure of language. They do succeed in generating language from that probabilistic structures that they've induced from exposure. So it seems to me that they are an existence proof of a system that can achieve language proficiency based on exposure alone. I wonder what is the unique aspect of a generative model that can't be captured from a probabilistic system?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, I think. So I think they're never perfect. So they're never, if they're 90% correct, that's supposed to be a very good score for these models. And they do make, of course, you have hallucinations and things like that. They do make mistakes sometimes, and they are very weird mistakes. So they are mistakes that a child would never make. And the models do make those mistakes. So that also gives you an indication that, if you have a lot of data, then of course the probability of getting it right increases with the more data you have. It increases. So, but the errors, I think, show you that the way they compute this is quite different from the way we do it, because we would never make those kind of mistakes.
I mean, my observation is that actually the humans in their language behaviour are strongly probabilistic. We see this every time we encounter a word frequency effect or a sentence predictability effect. And actually, the behavioural and neural data that you get from humans reading or listening is very well accounted for by the kinds of probabilities that are generated by those large language models. So I'm not sure I would see an in principle objection. I guess what you're saying is that there are events with probability of 0 that the large language models generate that no human ever would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the very fact that they need so much data, I mean, that tells you something as well. That if
Very
they
inefficient compared to the wonders of the human brain.
yes, well, as Altman said, but if the system, the computational system was identical to ours, then why would you need all the? So there has to be, the sort of thing that Altman is looking for, of which we are existing proof, seems to be missing still. And also, there was a paper recently, I think a PNAS, I can't remember the authors now, but that, the model generated very much human-like language, and my colleague Zangwill Fong analyzed it with existing databases, and the model makes a complete hash of it. So it also depends on what kind of database you use for the model.
Yeah, thanks very much. This was great to see from songbirds to LLM. And on the LLM side, so I was intrigued by the Altman quote, right? Where on first glance I thought, well, that's a bit naive to think that at some point the models will reach a human level. Because everything you talked about pretty much, like with sensitive periods, the fact that there is some, clearly, the system is front-loaded in some way, innate components. Clearly, that's not there in LLMs. But on the other hand, then I was thinking, well, but maybe one can build in certain constraints into those models where, well, I don't know how that can be done technologically, but I guess, well, to ask the question, do you think what he's proposing or what the hope he has is ever going to be realized, or is it just a silly idea to push that?
I think it's a silly idea, but it has, I think it's also interesting from a philosophical point of view, that why would, I mean, it's like a devaluation, I think, of the human mind, that, we are sort of imperfect computers, and given 10 years or something, the computers will be much better than we are at these things, or we are almost like animals. We are like other animals, and there's nothing special about, like Franz de Waal used to say, there's nothing special about language. Animals have it too, and this odd idea that why would you want to do that? Because obviously there is a difference, and also, for instance, Daniel Dennett, who died recently, he has this sort of had these weird ideas about, consciousness is illusion and things like that, and also sort of, devaluing the human mind, I think. And he also, at the same time, said, we should be very careful with AI because, it's dangerous, the developments in AI. And I think because he thinks that the human mind works like an LLM, and so if the LLMs get better and better, they will sort of take over. And so it's very interesting philosophical viewpoint.
But you could imagine that LLMs take over because they're very good at what they're doing, right? They adapt or they're programmed to solve certain problems really well, whether that's like, or similar to what humans do, that may not be relevant, right? They may just get really, really good at, dealing with, war situations, or figuring out certain things that where it doesn't matter how good or bad humans are or what humans do. It's just that, well, they may become dangerous because they are targeting something very specific that could be very detrimental to the human race.
Well, I mean, it's already happening with drones and things like that, and
Yes, exactly, yes.
I suppose it shows that the war is not rational.
Yes.
Isha.
One really important thing that infants do, which might help explain some of it, is that they recognise the communicative intention of another person. And that seems to be a constraint that helps them pick up this thing you're talking about that is extra, that the mind because babies who are not very good at recognising intentional communicative intent don't pick up language very well. So an extreme example would be autism. What do you think about species that are better at recognising communicative intent, like dogs? So you didn't mention dog language studies.
No. Well, I'm afraid of dogs myself, but yeah. So I think for dogs, it's more or less the same story. I think so. That you can train them very well to do all kinds of things, but I don't think they are generative themselves or they communicate in that particular way as we do. And yeah. So what was the beginning of your question?
Not really that communicative intent is one of the things missing out of your analysis, but that really puts why
Yeah.
might be special.
Well, on the other hand, yeah. So, but on the other hand, there are lots of examples of when children acquire language that they acquire language without communication at all, and so you know the example of the Nicaraguan orphanage for deaf children. You know that example.
I don't know.
Oh, so they studied an orphanage in Nicaragua with deaf children, and they were orphans. So they were never taught. Of course, they couldn't hear, so they were never. They don't know about spoken language. They were never taught sign language, and at some stage they developed their own sign language amongst themselves. And linguists have studied that sign language, and they say yes, it's a bit like British Sign Language or other sign language. It has the same grammatical structure that other languages have. So it looks like, without any training whatsoever, they have the language ability in them, and it comes out in this particular way.
Because they want to communicate.
Yes, but the possibility is there before the use in communication, in this case.
So maybe linking two previous questions, I think maybe Sam Altman misses two things, but he might be closer than he thinks. I mean, one of them is evolution. So I think our brains are pre-configured, and I think that's an engineering issue. So I think once they figure out how to design LLMs or maybe other models, or maybe next generation, that uses constraints that our brains have acquired over millions of years of evolution, maybe then they are in a better starting position. And the other thing is, maybe that's related to Usha's question, infants interact with the world, and that's something ChatGPT doesn't. I mean, it's only fed what we've already used in the past. But I think in the not so distant future, if they connect ChatGPT with robots that walk around and are pre-configured to recognize, other people, other robots' intention, I mean, that they have this kind of evolutionary configuration and start learning in the real world, then we are in business. Then we are.
Depending on your viewpoint, yes, we're in trouble maybe. But the point about evolution, of course, is that you mentioned millions of years of evolution, but then you would logically think that then you would think that maybe our closest relatives would have some language-like ability. And actually, there was a recent paper, again in Nature Communications, again by Japanese colleagues, who came up with something called core merge or something. It's sort of, the first instance of merge, and they found it in birds as well. And so trying to come up with some kind of linguistic idea in these birds, and we've analyzed that and commented on that. Again, not in Nature. But that it has nothing to do with merge whatsoever. So it has nothing to do with linguistic structure building. I mean, the idea is it has to be there, but that's not the case, I think. And so, if it is true that only we have language, of course, it can't be more than 200,000 years old. So, so maybe something happened. Of course, there's the infamous mutation idea by Chomsky and others, Berwick, that something happened that enabled this basic operation called merge to build these structures. And the way the way that in which this computational efficiency is always trumps communicative efficiency is maybe because of that it didn't arise out of the need to communicate, but it just arose just like that. And then later on, we could use it for communication, but probably it was internal to begin with. And so yeah, something happened. So if you could capture that something that happened in your models, that maybe that would. But I think we still don't know how to do that.
Other thoughts? Yeah.
I wonder how the neural mechanisms with regards to an infant acquiring a language compares and contrasts with an adult learning a second, third, or fourth language, and how that would speak to the tension between language and the AI models.
Yeah, so I think learning a second language for us is quite different, I think, from a first language. But I think for an infant, what the infant has to learn is the sounds that go with its native language, and the peculiarities of the grammar of the native language. But the basic principles are there, I think. So you can see that the example I just gave, that you don't need to teach them grammar, these children, for them to externalize the language that is inside. And there are lots of examples. My colleague Stephen Crane has done lots of work with very young children. They play all kinds of games involving language, and that, for instance, I don't know exactly the details of it, but he compared Chinese children to English-speaking children growing up in an English environment. And the Chinese children sometimes use certain constructions, can't remember exactly what they were, that Chinese people don't use, but English people do. So apparently they use some kind of grammatical construction that is the sort of default for any kind of language. It just so happens that in the country where they live, they don't use that kind of construction, and the other way around. So apparently it's all there, but it just depends on the environment exactly how you're going to externalize it. And of course that involves a lot of learning. But they're very good at that. So when the children are 2 years old, they learn about 10 new words a day or something. And the way and how they have to put these words together, they seem to know that very, very quickly indeed.
I'm an adult though who's like 30 years old, trying to learn a second language where the activity gets a lot more cognitive and less adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how the systems differ from each other, and the second one probably is closer to AI paradigm than the first one, which is a lot more survival based and emotional too.
Yes, maybe, yes. Well, in that sense, I mean, there is also, we briefly talked about impossible languages. So you may know there's a very interesting study by Andrea Moro and colleagues. They looked at impossible languages. So these were German subjects who could learn a new language, either Japanese or Italian. And then, so they never spoke these languages before. And these subjects were told that, if you say in Italian, I love you, you don't use the subject, you say love you. And there's sort of, well, what an odd language, where's the subject? Okay, but we can learn this. We can learn all kinds of other languages. And then they had a condition where they say, well, a negation in Italian works like this. So you don't say Giovanni doesn't eat a pear, but Giovanni eats the no pear. That's how Italians speak. And it's, well, again, what a weird language, but we can learn any kind of bizarre grammars. So they learn them, and it turns out that, so they can learn them, the real grammar and the impossible language grammar equally well. If you then do fMRI and look at Broca's area on the left-hand side of the brain, and it turns out the more you learn the real Italian, the more there is activity in Broca's area, but not for the fake Italian. So apparently the brain sort of recognizes real language from impossible language.
Okay, any other thoughts? If not, I'll bring this session to a close and thank everyone, well, particularly Johan, for an incredibly interesting talk. And thank everyone for supporting this important departmental lecture series. It's great to see everyone here on Friday night. So thank you. There will be drinks at 6 o'clock in the lab. Be there. The department actually does pay for the first round, so it's worth going if you can. Some really interesting cocktails. So we'll see you there if you decide to come along.
Maybe
so
we need to clarify it's not the actual lab, but
the pub type place.
Yeah,
it's called the
it's
lab.
a pub
It's on
called the
Regent
lab.
Street. Okay? You'll see a group of us go down there in about 10 minutes. Right, thank you. And thank you.